In the frozen dawn of January 15th of 1943, when the Baltic wind carved through barracks like a surgeon's blade, Elizabeth Miller watched as Dr. Karl Gebhardt entered Block 23 with instruments that gleamed under the harsh lights. 28 years old, with haunted eyes that had witnessed 2 years of systematized cruelty, she pressed herself against the splintered wall as guards dragged a Polish prisoner named Jadwiga from her bunk. The woman's leg, grotesquely swollen from a previous procedure, left a trail of yellowish fluid across the floor as they hauled her toward the makeshift surgical table. 4 SS nurses with porcelain-perfect posture prepared glass vials of bacteria, scalpels sharp enough to slice through bone, and sutures coarse as twine, while Dr. Gebhardt lectured 3 medical students on battlefield wound simulation. His voice carried the refined cadence of academia, discussing gangrene cultivation as casually as one might describe roses in a garden. The most methodical medical torture program ever documented in the women's camp at Ravensbrück was about to claim its 73rd victim. While outside, ravens gathered on the electrified fence, their black silhouettes a silent witness to methodical horrors that defied comprehension. This is the story of how a lakeside estate in northern Germany became the site of unspeakable experiments on women's bodies, and what the survivors risked to ensure the world would know their truth. Subscribe now to discover how evidence hidden in a bird's nest eventually condemned the perpetrators at Nuremberg. The lake shimmered with deceptive tranquility beyond the electrified fence. Water stretched toward distant pine forests, a cruel reminder of the natural beauty that surrounded Ravensbrück concentration camp. Located 55 miles north of Berlin, near the town of Fürstenberg, this isolated compound had been constructed in 1939 as the largest women-only concentration camp in the German Reich. The site had been selected with meticulous care, remote enough to obscure its purpose from the outside world, yet accessible by rail for prisoner transports. What had once been hunting grounds for German aristocracy became a killing field where the Third Reich conducted its brutal experiments in human degradation. By 1945, more than 130,000 women from over 20 countries would pass through its gates. Only a fraction would survive to see liberation. The original camp encompassed acres of barren ground, surrounded by walls topped with electrical wire. Guard towers positioned at precise intervals housed machine guns aimed inward. The administrative buildings, constructed of solid brick with large windows and proper heating, stood in stark contrast to the prisoner barracks, hastily constructed wooden structures with insufficient insulation against the bitter northern German winters. This architectural disparity perfectly illustrated the Nazi worldview: comfort and dignity for those deemed superior, bare survival at best for the inferior. Elizabeth Miller had arrived in the winter of 1941, transported from Munich after being arrested for distributing anti-Nazi leaflets at the university where she had once studied literature, the daughter of a mathematics professor who had been removed from his position for refusing to sign a loyalty oath to Hitler. Elizabeth had grown up believing in the primacy of truth and the moral obligation to speak against injustice. These principles, instilled since childhood, had brought her to Ravensbrück, where they would be tested beyond anything she had ever imagined. The journey north had been 3 days of standing-room-only cattle cars, without water, without food, without sanitation. 80 women crammed into a space designed for 8 livestock animals, their bodies pressed so tightly that when someone died, they remained upright, held in place by the living. The air inside became thick with the stench of urine, feces, vomit, and the particular odor of human terror, a mixture of sour sweat and something more primal that Elizabeth would never forget. Women died during transit, their bodies held upright by the press of humanity until the train stopped and the doors scraped open. The guards laughed as the dead tumbled onto frozen ground. Elizabeth would later recall how they were ordered to strip naked in the snow, bodies inspected, hair shaved, possessions confiscated, all while male guards watched and made vulgar comments about their breasts, their pubic hair, their emaciated frames. The women who wept were beaten. Those who tried to cover themselves received additional blows from rubber truncheons that left purple-black bruises that would not fade for weeks. "You should consider yourselves fortunate," said Oberaufseherin Maria Mandel, the chief female guard, as she walked between rows of shivering naked women. "In Auschwitz, they have no use for most of you. Here, you may live as long as you work." She paused before an elderly Jewish woman who had collapsed to her knees. "Or you may not." She nodded to a guard who dragged the woman away. A single gunshot echoed minutes later. No one dared to look in its direction. "Property of the Reich," the camp commander had declared as new arrivals were processed. "You have no names here, only numbers." Elizabeth became prisoner 42,619, marked with a red triangle for political prisoners. The number was tattooed on her left forearm, the needle pressing so deeply that blood pooled around each puncture. The pain was secondary to the humiliation, the systematic stripping away of everything that had made her an individual. Her name, her clothes, her hair, even the wedding ring from her husband, who had been sent to Dachau months earlier and whose fate remained unknown. The small details of normal existence, the ability to use a toilet in privacy, to wash when dirty, to speak without permission, all vanished in a single afternoon. Others wore different symbols: yellow stars for Jewish women, black triangles for those deemed asocial, purple for Jehovah's Witnesses, pink for lesbians, green for criminals, and blue for foreign forced laborers. The hierarchy of suffering was established from the first moment, with German political prisoners and criminals often selected as kapos, prisoners given limited authority over others. This deliberate strategy created division, pitting victim against victim in a perverse system where survival might depend on complicity. Jews occupied the lowest rung, receiving the worst work assignments, the least food, the most brutal treatment. Ravensbrück was not primarily an extermination camp for Jews. Those went directly to Auschwitz-Birkenau or Treblinka, but Jewish prisoners who arrived at Ravensbrück faced particular cruelty. They were housed separately in the overcrowded Jewish block, where disease spread most rapidly. Their food rations were smaller. Their work assignments were deliberately designed to kill through exhaustion. The barracks stretched in rigid rows, each designed to house 250 women, but typically crammed with more than 600. 3 or 4 prisoners shared each narrow wooden bunk, sleeping on thin straw mattresses, crawling with lice, fleas, and bedbugs that left constellations of red bites across their skin. At night, rats scurried across the floor and sometimes across the sleeping women, occasionally biting those too weak or exhausted to swat them away. The barracks had no insulation. In winter, temperatures dropped so low that women sometimes woke to find their hair frozen to the walls they slept against. In summer, the heat turned the crowded spaces into incubators for typhus-carrying lice. The stench was overwhelming. Unwashed bodies, infected wounds, overflowing latrines, and the constant underlying smell of smoke from the crematorium that operated day and night. New arrivals vomited from the smell until their bodies adapted. Eventually, most prisoners lost their sensitivity to odors, a small mercy in an existence defined by sensory assaults. The sound of the crematorium became the soundtrack of Ravensbrück, a low, constant rumble punctuated by the screams of women being punished in the camp square. At night, prisoners heard the vehicles arriving with new victims, the shouted orders, the occasional gunshots. Some blocks were situated close enough to the crematorium that ash would settle on the roofs and drift through cracks in the walls, covering sleeping prisoners with the remains of those who had gone before them. "We breathed in the dead," Elizabeth would later write in her memoir. "Now their ash entered our lungs, became part of us. Perhaps this was the only form of burial many would ever have, to be carried within the bodies of those who survived." Daily life followed a brutal routine. Wake-up call came at 4:30 in the morning, signaled by a siren that tore through dreams and jolted even the most exhausted prisoners to immediate alertness. Failure to respond instantly resulted in beatings or worse. The women had exactly 30 minutes to fold their blankets with military precision, wash in freezing water, when water was available at all, and drink a cup of ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns. The liquid was bitter and provided no nutritional value, but it was often the only warm thing they would receive all day, and many cupped their hands around the containers, absorbing what little heat they could before facing the pre-dawn cold. Any infraction during morning preparation resulted in beatings, blankets improperly folded, bowls not cleaned to perfection, speaking during wash time, looking directly at a guard, not looking directly at a guard when addressed. The rules were both rigid and arbitrary, designed to create an atmosphere where punishment was inevitable and terror constant. At 5 o'clock, the women stood for appel, roll call, in the central square. They stood in perfect rows, 10 by 10, regardless of weather, sometimes for hours if numbers did not match or if guards simply wished to inflict additional suffering. During winter roll calls, temperatures often dropped below 0 degrees Fahrenheit. Women stood in threadbare uniforms, many without proper shoes, some with feet wrapped in paper or rags. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. Those who collapsed were dragged to the side. If they revived, they might receive 25 lashes. If they did not, they joined the daily collection of bodies outside the crematorium. During one particularly brutal roll call in January of 1943, prisoners stood for 7 hours in a blizzard while guards conducted a barrack search. 237 women died of exposure that day. Their bodies were left in the snow as roll call continued, a lesson to those still standing about the cost of perceived disobedience. Work assignments began at 6 o'clock. Ravensbrück operated as a labor camp, with prisoners assigned to the Siemens electrical factory adjacent to the main compound, where they assembled electrical components for German aircraft and rockets. The work required precision and concentration, tasks made nearly impossible by malnutrition, exhaustion, and the constant threat of punishment for mistakes. Each workstation had production quotas that increased regularly. Failure to meet quotas resulted in extended shifts without food or beatings that left women unable to work the following day, creating a vicious cycle of punishment. Others labored in workshops producing textiles and uniforms for the German military. Women who had been professional seamstresses before the war taught those with no experience, an underground education system that possibly saved lives by helping new prisoners become productive quickly. The SS cared only about output, not how the skills were acquired. Some of the most dreaded assignments were in the construction commandos, carrying heavy stones from the nearby quarry. Women hauled rocks weighing up to 50 pounds across uneven ground for 12 hours a day. Those who stumbled or dropped their loads were beaten with rifle butts. Many sustained hernias, spinal injuries, and chronic joint damage that caused lifelong disability among survivors. A particularly feared punishment was assignment to the punishment block, where women spent their days standing in cold water up to their knees, harvesting reeds from the lake. The combination of cold, wet conditions and exhaustion led to pneumonia that killed most within weeks. Guards referred to this assignment as the slow death sentence. Some women worked in the gardens that produced food for the SS, food they were forbidden to touch under penalty of death. The temptation to steal a carrot or potato was overwhelming for the starving prisoners. Those caught were publicly flogged with 25 lashes, then hanged in the camp square as an example. Despite the consequences, hunger drove women to take the risk. Some developed systems for smuggling tiny amounts of food, a few peas hidden in the hem of a dress, a small potato concealed in a cheek like a squirrel storing nuts, then later shared with the weakest in their barracks. Elizabeth had been assigned to the textiles workshop where women worked 14-hour shifts making uniforms. The workshop was housed in a long, poorly ventilated building with insufficient light, particularly during winter months when darkness fell by 4 in the afternoon. The women worked by the dim yellow glow of bare bulbs that strained their eyes and caused chronic headaches. The sewing machines were old models, prone to jamming. When this happened, the prisoner operating the machine was held responsible, accused of sabotage and punished accordingly. Fingers bleeding from countless needle pricks, eyes straining in poor light, they met impossible quotas under the watchful eyes of female SS guards known for their particular brutality. Dorothea Binns, the deputy chief guard, was notorious for setting her German shepherd on prisoners who slowed their pace. The dog was trained to attack the face and throat. Women mauled by the animal received no medical treatment. Their wounds festered, often leading to sepsis and death. Chief Guard Maria Mandel collected the tattooed skin of prisoners after their deaths, having it made into lampshades and gloves. She walked through the camp in spotless uniforms, her boots polished to a mirror shine, often humming opera arias, a grotesque soundtrack to the beatings she administered. Her casual brutality was perhaps more terrifying than outright rage. She could go from patting a child prisoner on the head to ordering that same child beaten for a minor infraction, all without changing her pleasant expression. "We will wear you down until nothing remains," Mandel told new arrivals during their orientation, her voice carrying the refined accent of her middle-class Austrian upbringing. "You will work until you are used up. Then we will dispose of you like the waste you are." For many guards, cruelty became routine, not the exception but the expectation. Later, at war crimes trials, many would claim they were simply following orders. What such defenses failed to explain was the creative sadism, the seemingly limitless capacity for inventing new forms of humiliation and torment that went well beyond any official policy. Food consisted of thin rutabaga soup at midday and 200 grams of moldy bread in the evening. The soup was mostly water, with a few floating pieces of vegetable, occasionally containing small white worms that the prisoners learned to eat rather than discard, an extra bit of protein their bodies desperately needed. The bread was made from poor quality flour, mixed with sawdust to increase bulk while decreasing nutritional value. On rare occasions, they received a thin smear of margarine or a spoonful of watery jam. The entire daily ration contained fewer than 600 calories, while their work assignments often required expenditure of 2,000 or more. Starvation was a deliberate strategy. The Nazi administration calculated precisely how long a prisoner could survive on starvation rations while still performing useful labor. Documents recovered after liberation revealed internal memoranda discussing the optimal extraction of labor value before terminal deterioration. Bureaucratic language for working prisoners to death as efficiently as possible. Women lost 30 to 50 pounds within weeks of arrival, their bodies consuming themselves. First went body fat, then muscle tissue. Eventually, the body began breaking down organs. Skin turned gray and paper-thin, tearing easily and healing slowly. Hair fell out in clumps. Teeth loosened in receding gums and often fell out. Menstruation stopped, a condition prisoners called camp menopause. Women in their 20s developed the appearance of the elderly, stooped posture, shuffling gait, deeply lined faces. Those who looked at their reflections in water buckets or broken glass often could not recognize themselves. The transformation from human to ghost took approximately 3 months. Those who survived longer did so through extraordinary resilience or access to extra food through work assignments in the SS kitchens or through packages from home, though these privileges were increasingly rare as the war progressed. By 1944, the International Red Cross packages that had sustained many prisoners were systematically confiscated by the SS and distributed among the German staff. Disease spread uncontrollably. Typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, and pneumonia claimed thousands. The unsanitary conditions, primitive latrines that overflowed during rainstorms, limited access to water for washing, the impossibility of maintaining even basic hygiene, created perfect conditions for epidemic outbreaks. Typhus, spread by the lice that infested clothing and bedding, caused high fever, excruciating headaches, and a distinctive rash. In advanced stages, victims experienced delirium and often lost consciousness before death. During the typhus epidemic of December 1942, more than 1,000 women died within 2 weeks. Dysentery reduced women to skeletal figures, too weak to control their bodily functions. Those who suffered from it were often abandoned by other prisoners, not from lack of compassion, but from fear of contagion and the practical impossibility of caring for someone experiencing constant, uncontrollable diarrhea when toilet facilities consisted of open trenches used by hundreds and cleaned irregularly at best. Many dysentery victims simply lay in their own excrement until death provided release. Tuberculosis spread rapidly in the overcrowded barracks, transmitted through the air when infected individuals coughed. The characteristic symptoms, coughing blood, night sweats, weight loss, fatigue, were difficult to distinguish from the general effects of starvation and overwork. Many women did not realize they had tuberculosis until the disease was advanced, by which time they had likely infected dozens of others. The camp hospital, known as the Revier, was a place to die, not recover. Medical supplies were virtually non-existent. The few prisoner doctors, women who had been physicians before their arrest, worked without medicines, proper instruments, bandages, or disinfectants. They performed surgeries using sharpened spoons as scalpels and unraveled clothing as suture material. They set broken bones without anesthesia and treated infections with compresses of dirty snow when nothing else was available. Those too ill to work were selected for transport, a euphemism everyone understood. The camp administration distributed lists of prisoners deemed unproductive, requiring each barracks to provide a certain number of names. This created impossible moral dilemmas for prisoners with leadership roles. Who should be selected? The elderly, who had little chance of survival? The chronically ill, who suffered constantly? The very young, whose smaller bodies couldn't withstand the work demands? There were no good choices, only variations of complicity with murder. The black trucks came at night, taking the sick to be gassed either at the nearby youth camp at Uckermark or, earlier in the war, to Bernburg Psychiatric Institution, where the T4 euthanasia program continued in secret after its official termination. Women selected for these transports often knew their fate. Some went quietly, too weak to resist or perhaps welcoming an end to suffering. Others fought desperately, clinging to bunks or to other prisoners, screaming names of children they would never see again. The guards used rifle butts and dogs to force compliance. Those who remained behind listened to the trucks departing, each carrying 40 to 60 women to their deaths. The sound of engines fading into the night became a requiem more heartbreaking than any formal funeral. The next morning, empty bunks were quickly filled with new arrivals, the cycle continuing without interruption. The Nazi administration used terminology that deliberately obscured the reality of mass murder. Internal documents referred to special treatment, evacuation, resettlement, and natural reduction, never to killing or extermination. This bureaucratic language created psychological distance between the perpetrators and their crimes. It allowed camp personnel to process paperwork for thousands of deaths without ever confronting the moral implications of their actions. Clerks who had never personally harmed anyone nonetheless facilitated genocide through their meticulous record-keeping. Yet even in this landscape of systemic cruelty, one aspect of Ravensbrück stood apart in its calculated horror. Beginning in the summer of 1942, the camp became the site of medical experiments authorized at the highest levels of the Nazi hierarchy. These were not isolated incidents carried out by rogue doctors, but carefully planned research programs with specific military and ideological objectives, approved by Heinrich Himmler himself and documented in regular progress reports to Berlin. Dr. Karl Gebhardt, Heinrich Himmler's personal physician and a professor of medicine at the University of Berlin, established a surgical station in Block 23. A tall, imposing figure with wire-rimmed glasses and immaculately manicured hands, Gebhardt had once been a respected orthopedic surgeon whose research had been published in international medical journals. His position as president of the German Red Cross lent a perverse legitimacy to the atrocities he supervised. His stated purpose was to advance military medicine by simulating battlefield wounds and testing treatment methods. German troops on the Eastern Front were experiencing high casualty rates from infected wounds, particularly gas gangrene that often necessitated amputation or resulted in death. Gebhardt proposed to systematically study wound infections and treatments, particularly the effectiveness of newly developed sulfonamide drugs. In practice, this meant deliberately mutilating healthy women to study infection and experimental treatments. The research had no scientific validity. It failed to control for variables such as the subject's compromised nutritional status. It used inconsistent protocols. And it was conducted without anesthesia or sterile conditions, introducing so many confounding factors that no reliable conclusions could be drawn. This was not science, but sadism dressed in medical terminology. The victims were primarily young Polish women, many of them members of the resistance, who became known as the rabbits because of their attempts to hop away when they saw the guards coming to take them for procedures. The term originated with the SS guards, a dehumanizing label that reduced women to experimental animals. Yet the prisoners reclaimed the name, transforming it into a symbol of solidarity. To be a rabbit became a mark of both suffering and resistance. In total, 74 women were used in the bone, muscle, and nerve regeneration experiments. Their average age was 23, the youngest was 16. Selection criteria included good physical health and youth, women whose bodies would provide the best research material, and who might survive multiple procedures. Most were Polish political prisoners arrested for resistance activities, chosen partly because they had no legal recourse and partly because Nazi racial ideology classified Poles as subhuman and therefore acceptable experimental subjects. None had consented to the experiments. All were selected arbitrarily and told that if they resisted, they and their families would be executed. Many initially believed they were being taken for routine medical examinations. They discovered the truth only when they were strapped to operating tables and saw the surgical instruments being prepared. The women were not told the purpose of the experiments. They received no information about what would be done to them or why. When they asked questions, they were beaten. When they screamed during procedures, they were beaten more severely. One prisoner, Bogomila Babinska, who asked what was being injected into her leg wound, had her front teeth knocked out by a guard using the butt of a pistol. Her dental injuries became infected, yet she received no treatment and eventually lost her entire lower jaw to necrosis. The procedures followed a standard pattern. First, the women's legs were cut open, usually on the outer thigh or calf. The incisions were deep, exposing muscle tissue and sometimes bone. Muscles and nerves were deliberately damaged, crushed, or severed with surgical tools. Glass, wood, or metal fragments introduced into the wounds simulated battlefield debris. Dirt and bacteria were rubbed directly into exposed tissue. Some women had segments of bone removed to study regeneration, or had foreign materials implanted, including glass, rusted nails, wood splinters, and cloth fibers contaminated with bacteria. The injuries were then infected with bacteria, including gangrene and tetanus. Bacterial cultures were grown specifically for this purpose, with different strains tested to determine which produced the most severe infections. The women developed high fevers, excruciating pain, and massive swelling. Many experienced delirium from sepsis. Several developed tetanus with its characteristic painful muscle contractions and spasms. Different treatment methods were tested, including new sulfonamide drugs. Some wounds were deliberately left untreated as controls. Others received experimental treatments in varying doses and combinations. The doctors documented the progression of infection with clinical detachment, measuring wound dimensions, photographing necrotizing tissue, recording temperature charts, and extracting tissue samples for laboratory examination without anesthesia. Many victims died from infection or subsequent operations that involved removing large sections of muscle and bone. Those who survived were left with permanent disabilities, legs that could not bear weight, muscle tissue replaced by scar tissue, persistent pain from damaged nerves, and disfiguring scars. Some required amputation months or years after liberation, as their bodies finally surrendered to the long-term effects of the mutilations. Elizabeth was not selected for experiments, but worked in the adjacent barracks and witnessed the aftermath. She later described what she saw in testimony smuggled out of the camp. They return unconscious, carried between two prisoners. The bandages are soaked through with blood and pus within hours. The screaming begins when they wake. It does not stop for days. We take turns sitting with them through the night, trying to ease their suffering with cold compresses made from our own drinking water ration. Some pray for death, some receive it. Those who survive are left with grotesquely disfigured legs. None will ever walk normally again. The experimental subjects were housed together in Block 23 after procedures, ostensibly for observation, but in reality to prevent the wider camp population from witnessing the full extent of their suffering. This isolation would have been complete were it not for the prisoner medical staff who provided what little care they could. These nurses, themselves prisoners, risked severe punishment to smuggle in clean rags for bandages, to administer aspirin stolen from the SS infirmary, or simply to hold the hands of the women during the worst pain. Elizabeth had a distant cousin who had been a nurse in civilian life and now worked in the prisoner medical service. Through this connection, she gained access to Block 23, initially to deliver messages, later to assist with basic care. She did this despite knowing that any association with the experimental subjects made her vulnerable to selection herself. The risk seemed insignificant compared to the moral imperative to help. What Elizabeth witnessed in Block 23 went beyond the standard brutality of the camp. The women there suffered not just from deliberate injuries, but from the particularly intimate violation of having their bodies treated as laboratory materials. Many spoke of feeling that their humanity had been completely erased. They were no longer women, prisoners, or even enemies, but simply tissue to be damaged and observed. Jadwiga Kaminska, 23 years old, arrested for courier activities in the Polish underground, was operated on 6 times between August 1942 and January 1943. Her story illustrates the progression of the experiments and the indifference to human suffering that characterized them. Before her arrest, Jadwiga had been a university student studying biology in Warsaw. Her father was a mathematics professor, her mother a concert pianist. She had a younger brother who was executed during the Warsaw Uprising, and an older sister who escaped to England and joined the Polish government in exile. Jadwiga joined the resistance in 1940, after witnessing German soldiers shoot 20 civilians in retaliation for a sabotage operation. Her role involved carrying messages between resistance cells and distributing underground newspapers. Her first operation at Ravensbrück involved an 8-inch incision on her right calf, into which wood splinters and glass fragments were embedded. No anesthesia was used. She was fully conscious as Dr. Gebhardt lectured medical students about wound contamination while cutting into her leg. The wound was then infected with Staphylococcus bacteria. She developed a high fever and was delirious for 3 days. The second procedure, performed 3 weeks later, involved reopening the wound, which had begun to heal, and introducing a new bacterial strain along with dirt collected from the campgrounds. This time, her wound was photographed daily to document the spread of infection. The pain was so severe that she begged the prisoner nurse to kill her. After the third procedure, her right leg was so severely infected that amputation was discussed but rejected because it would interfere with the experiment protocol. The medical notes, recovered after liberation, stated, Subject 43 presents excellent example of advanced tissue necrosis with minimal treatment intervention. Amputation would prematurely terminate observation of natural disease progression. She developed sepsis, but somehow survived. When the infection finally began to recede, the doctors performed 3 more operations, removing muscle tissue, extracting bone fragments, and testing different suture techniques. By January 1943, Jadwiga's right leg was essentially destroyed, a mass of scar tissue, exposed bone, and chronically infected wounds that would never properly heal. When the experiments were finally discontinued, she could only move with the help of makeshift crutches fashioned from broken broom handles. During the endless nights of pain in Block 23, Jadwiga formed a close bond with Elizabeth. Both educated women, they discussed literature and science when Jadwiga was lucid enough. They recited poetry from memory, Mickiewicz for Jadwiga, Goethe for Elizabeth, creating brief mental escapes from their surroundings. More importantly, they shared information. Jadwiga described in precise detail what happened in the surgical room, while Elizabeth provided information about camp operations and the progression of the war gleaned from newly arriving prisoners. They did not see us as human, Jadwiga told Elizabeth one night as they huddled together for warmth. To them, we were laboratory animals, less than animals. At least a scientist might feel some compassion for a laboratory rat. They felt nothing as they cut into us. The most disturbing aspect of the medical experiments was the participation of doctors who had taken the Hippocratic oath to do no harm. These were not uneducated brutes, but highly trained medical professionals from prestigious universities. Dr. Gebhardt had been considered a brilliant surgeon before the war. Dr. Herta Oberhäuser, who assisted in many procedures, was one of the few female physicians in Germany. Dr. Fritz Fischer had published respected research on orthopedic rehabilitation techniques. Their willing participation in torture revealed how completely Nazi ideology had corrupted medical ethics. The principle of patient consent was dismissed as irrelevant. The concept of minimizing suffering was abandoned. The fundamental value of human life was replaced by a calculus where some lives, those deemed racially or ideologically inferior, had no inherent worth. The medical experiments were only one aspect of the calculated dehumanization at Ravensbrück. As the war progressed and the camp population swelled, conditions deteriorated further. By 1943, Ravensbrück, initially built for 6,000 prisoners, held more than 42,000 women. Overcrowding reached catastrophic levels. Women slept 5 to a bunk designed for 1. Those who could not fit into barracks slept outside, exposed to the elements. Food rations, already insufficient, were further reduced. Medical care virtually disappeared. Sanitation systems collapsed completely. Disease spread unchecked. The death rate increased exponentially. According to recovered SS records, in January 1943, approximately 300 women died at Ravensbrück. By January 1944, that number had risen to over 1,200. By January 1945, it exceeded 3,000. By 1944, the crematorium could not keep pace with the death rate. Bodies were stacked like cordwood outside the barracks, sometimes for days. In winter, they froze solid and had to be broken apart before cremation. In summer, they decomposed rapidly, attracting flies and rats. The smell permeated everything: clothes, skin, the thin gruel that passed for food. Many prisoners developed the ability to eat while surrounded by corpses, a survival adaptation that would haunt survivors for decades after liberation. The camp administration responded to the increasing death rate not by improving conditions, but by accelerating the killing process. As the Eastern Front collapsed and Soviet forces advanced westward, the SS began systematically eliminating prisoners who might later testify about their experiences. Those with knowledge of camp operations, those who had witnessed specific atrocities, those who had endured the medical experiments, all were targeted for execution. In February 1944, a gas chamber was constructed at Ravensbrück. Disguised as a shower building, it was located near the crematorium for efficiency. The camp administration denied its existence, claiming it was a specialized bathing facility for decontamination purposes. Prisoners assigned to construction knew better. They recognized the sealed doors, the special ventilation system, the absence of actual plumbing for showers. The gas chamber used carbon monoxide rather than the Zyklon B employed at Auschwitz. Prisoners would be herded into what appeared to be a shower room. Once the airtight doors were sealed, engine exhaust was pumped in. Death took approximately 20 minutes and was preceded by desperate attempts to escape, frantic scratching at the walls and doors, climbing on top of other prisoners to reach higher air, and finally convulsions as the oxygen-starved brain shut down. After ventilation, special prisoner commandos removed the bodies, extracted gold teeth, and took the corpses to the crematorium. Healthy women, particularly those who had witnessed atrocities or were considered security risks, began to disappear in groups of 100 to 150. They would be called for transfer to a work camp or for special bathing and would never return. Their possessions would appear in the sorting room the following day. Their bunks would be assigned to new arrivals, and the camp administration would deny they had ever existed. The camp kept meticulous records of these selections, though they used euphemistic language. Internal documents referred to special treatment or evacuation to the east, never explicitly mentioning killing. The bureaucratic language created psychological distance between the decision makers and the consequences of their decisions. It allowed the camp administration to process murder as an administrative matter, a problem of logistics rather than a crime against humanity. Prisoners assigned to construction knew better. Healthy women, particularly those who had witnessed atrocities or were considered security risks, began to disappear in groups of 100 to 150. Among the first selected for gassing were the surviving rabbits, whose mutilated bodies were evidence of war crimes. The Nazi administration, increasingly concerned about losing the war and facing consequences, sought to eliminate witnesses. In March 1944, 26 rabbits received orders to report for transfer to a lighter work assignment. The women immediately recognized this as a death sentence. What happened next demonstrated the extraordinary solidarity that had developed among prisoners. Despite the SS strategy of division, Polish women throughout the camp mobilized to hide the rabbits. They created diversions during roll call to confuse the count. They swapped identities, with healthy women answering to the names of those selected for gassing. They created hiding places under floorboards, inside walls, and in the camp's few blind spots where guards rarely checked. The entire operation required hundreds of women to risk their lives, knowing that anyone caught helping the rabbits would face immediate execution. For 2 weeks, SS guards conducted increasingly frantic searches, accompanied by dogs and armed with rifles. They threatened collective punishment, 10 random executions for each missing rabbit. They withheld food from entire barracks. They conducted night raids. Yet the solidarity held. The rabbits remained hidden, moved constantly from location to location through an underground network that crossed national and linguistic barriers. The Nazi administration, facing this unexpected resistance, temporarily abandoned the plan to gas the rabbits. It was an extraordinary moment, perhaps the only successful mass resistance operation in the history of Nazi concentration camps. It demonstrated that even in the most controlled environment, human solidarity could sometimes overcome systematic terror. What they did not anticipate was the extraordinary resistance network that had developed among prisoners. Despite systematic efforts to prevent prisoner organization, frequent barracks, reassignments, prohibition of gatherings, punishment for unauthorized communication between work groups, women at Ravensbrück had created a sophisticated underground structure that crossed national and ideological boundaries. Elizabeth had become part of this network in 1943, using her position in the textiles workshop to pass messages between barracks. The resistance operated on multiple levels: spiritual, moral, and practical. They shared food with the weakest prisoners, stashing bread crusts and soup scraps for those most likely to die without extra nourishment. They established a rudimentary medical service, with prisoners who had nursing or medical training providing care with almost no supplies. They created an information network that tracked SS personnel movements and planned operations. They memorized the names and details of SS personnel for future testimony, including physical descriptions, ranks, behaviors, and specific atrocities witnessed. Perhaps most importantly, they maintained cultural life through secret educational programs. In barracks after lights out, professors gave lectures on history, literature, and science. Musicians hummed compositions from memory. Artists drew on scraps of paper with stolen pencils. Poets composed verses that were memorized by dozens of women to ensure survival, even if the creators did not. This preservation of culture became an act of resistance, a declaration that the Nazis might control their bodies but could not extinguish their minds. The resistance also engaged in practical sabotage. Women working in the Siemens factory deliberately assembled components incorrectly or damaged delicate machinery. Those in the uniform workshop subtly altered measurements or weakened seams. Those in administrative positions sometimes managed to alter records, removing names from transport lists or changing work assignments to protect vulnerable prisoners. The most dangerous and vital work of the resistance, however, was documenting the medical experiments. This task fell primarily to a group led by 4 French women: Germaine Tillion, an anthropologist who had been arrested for her resistance activities; Anise Postelvinet, who had worked for British intelligence; Geneviève de Gaulle Antonios, niece of General Charles de Gaulle; and Marie-Claude Vaillant Couturier, a photojournalist and communist resistance member. These women recognized that survival was uncertain, but ensuring evidence of Nazi crimes survived was essential for post-war justice. Working with Elizabeth and several Polish prisoners who had direct access to the experimental subjects, they began collecting evidence. The challenges were enormous. Paper was virtually non-existent in the camp. Writing implements were contraband, their possession punishable by flogging or death. Any documentation discovered by the SS would mean immediate execution, not just for the writer, but for everyone in their barracks. Despite these obstacles, they stole small scraps of paper from administrative offices, from packaging, from the edges of cement bags, anything that could hold writing. They made ink from rust mixed with urine, from charcoal mixed with water, from blood when necessary. They wrote with splinters of wood, with bent hairpins, with fingernails hardened in fire. They documented everything: dates of operations, names of doctors present, descriptions of procedures, names of victims, condition of survivors, names of those who died and how they died. Prisoner doctors and nurses who treated the rabbits provided technical medical descriptions. The victims themselves described their experiences in painful detail, determined that the world would someday know what had been done to them. They took immense risks to photograph the mutilated legs of the rabbits using a camera smuggled into the camp by a new prisoner who had hidden it in her vagina. The camera was tiny, originally designed for espionage, with film the size of a postage stamp. Operating it required not only extreme secrecy, but also technical skill, as images had to be properly exposed despite poor lighting conditions. The photographer, whose name is recorded only as Joanna in resistance documents, had been a professional photojournalist before her arrest. The challenge became how to preserve this evidence and get it out of the camp. Document destruction was a constant risk. Barracks were regularly searched. Anyone found with incriminating materials faced immediate execution. Even if documents could be hidden inside the camp, liberation was uncertain. If the camp was evacuated or destroyed before Allied forces arrived, all evidence might be lost. The women devised an ingenious system of multiple redundancies. Messages were written in urine on scraps of fabric from the workshop, which remained invisible until heated. These were sewn into the hems of garments being sent out of the camp as part of the textile production. Names and dates were encoded in embroidery patterns on handkerchiefs, specific stitch patterns representing letters and a code known only to resistance members. Small notes were hidden in the false bottoms of food containers returned to Red Cross officials after package deliveries. Different parts of the documentation were entrusted to different groups, ensuring that even if some were caught, others might succeed in preserving evidence. No single person knew all hiding locations or all transmission methods. This compartmentalization of knowledge protected the overall operation from complete exposure if individuals were captured and interrogated. The most significant breakthrough came when resistance members made contact with male prisoners from the nearby Sachsenhausen concentration camp who worked on maintenance projects at Ravensbrück. These men had access to the camp periphery and occasionally to the outside world on work details. Over months, tiny messages were passed during brief encounters in work areas. A note hidden in a tool handle whispered instructions during equipment handovers, signals using laundry hanging patterns to indicate drop points where documents could be hidden and retrieved. Through this male prisoner network, some documentation reached the Polish underground, which transmitted information to the Polish government in exile in London. By late 1943, Allied intelligence services had received preliminary reports about the medical experiments at Ravensbrück, though the full extent of the atrocities remained unclear. In early 1945, as the Allied forces advanced from both east and west, the SS began systematic efforts to eradicate evidence of their crimes. Records were burned, mass graves were exhumed, and bodies cremated. Witnesses were eliminated. The camp administration destroyed thousands of documents, particularly those related to the medical experiments, the gas chamber operations, and the death statistics. At Ravensbrück, this operation was overseen by Commandant Fritz Surin, who later claimed at his trial that he had been ordered to leave no witnesses and no evidence that could be used by Allied prosecutors. Camp guards worked day and night burning files in the crematorium. Prisoner clerks with knowledge of administration were executed. The experimental surgical ward in Block 23 was dismantled, equipment removed, and the building thoroughly cleaned to remove bloodstains and other evidence. It was during this period that Elizabeth made her most dangerous decision. Working with Jadwiga and 3 other Polish women, she compiled a complete list of victims of medical experiments, details of procedures, and the names of all doctors and nurses involved. The document included dates, locations, specific methods used, deaths that resulted, and testimonies from survivors. Unlike previous fragmentary documentation, this was a comprehensive record intended to serve as legal evidence after the war. This 12-page document, written on tissue-thin paper and microscopic handwriting, needed to survive, even if they did not. The women worked on it in shifts over 2 weeks, writing by moonlight after curfew, each contributing what they had witnessed or experienced directly. The paper was so thin that ink sometimes bled through, forcing them to start sections again. The handwriting was deliberately small to contain maximum information in minimum space, requiring the writers to rest their eyes frequently to prevent strain that would make the work impossible. "If we die, the truth must live," Jadwiga told Elizabeth as they finalized the document one night in February 1945. "Promise me you will get this out no matter what happens to us." Her face, once youthful and full, had become gaunt, with deep shadows under her eyes that never disappeared regardless of rest. Her hair had grown back partially after the initial shaving upon arrival, now a patchy gray despite her youth. Only her eyes retained their intensity, dark brown with flecks of gold that seemed to catch what little light penetrated the barracks at night. Elizabeth made the promise, though she had no clear plan for fulfilling it. The camp was increasingly isolated as the war contracted around Germany. Regular transports had ceased. Red Cross package deliveries were infrequent. The previously established channels for smuggling information had largely collapsed as contact prisoners were transferred or killed. The solution came from an unlikely source. Nina Ivanova, a Russian prisoner who worked in the camp's administrative office as a clerk, had access to incoming communications. While sorting papers in late February, she discovered that the Swedish Red Cross was negotiating with Himmler for the release of Scandinavian prisoners. Heinrich Himmler, anticipating Germany's defeat, was attempting to create goodwill with neutral countries that might intervene on his behalf with the Allies. The planned release of Norwegian and Danish prisoners represented a potential breach in the camp's isolation, a rare opportunity for information to leave with authorized departures. Through the camp's resistance network, Elizabeth and Jadwiga made contact with Sina Tomaros, a Norwegian prisoner scheduled for release. Sina had been arrested in Oslo for distributing anti-Nazi newspapers and had spent 14 months at Ravensbrück. She immediately agreed to help, recognizing the historical importance of the document and feeling a moral obligation to those who would remain behind. On April 3rd of 1945, as 7,000 Scandinavian prisoners were lined up for evacuation, Elizabeth approached Sina during the confusion. The document, sealed in wax paper and wrapped in cloth, was passed between them in a matter of seconds. Sina hid it in her hair, which had partially regrown since her arrival at the camp. The hiding place was not ideal. A thorough search would certainly discover it, but it was the only option available on short notice. "Look for a bird's nest in the eaves," Elizabeth whispered. "If there is any problem, hide it there." The reference was not random. During their planning, Jadwiga had recalled how during the Polish partisan resistance, important documents were often hidden in bird nests, locations unlikely to be searched by German patrols and naturally camouflaged. The technique had saved many resistance operations from discovery. At Ravensbrück, birds nested in the eaves of several buildings, including those near the camp gate where the prisoner transfer would occur. The transfer process was tense. SS guards checked identity papers against their lists. Red Cross officials watched, but did not intervene in the camp's internal procedures. Each prisoner was subject to a physical search, though these were conducted hastily due to the large number of departures. Sina stood in line for nearly 3 hours, the document burning against her scalp, before finally passing through the gate to the waiting Swedish buses. Just before her inspection, a commotion erupted elsewhere in the line. A prisoner had collapsed, either from exhaustion or as a deliberate diversion created by the resistance. Guards rushed to the scene. Sina's inspection was cursory, focused on ensuring she carried no valuables rather than searching for hidden papers. She boarded the bus without incident, though she did not truly feel safe until the convoy crossed the German border into Denmark. The document crossed the border into Sweden, where Sina immediately contacted both Swedish authorities and representatives of the Norwegian government in exile. Initially met with skepticism, the atrocities described seemed too extreme to be credible. She persisted until finding officials willing to take the information seriously. The document was translated into 3 languages, English, French, and Russian, to ensure accessibility to all Allied powers. The photographs smuggled out with the document proved particularly persuasive. Though small and somewhat blurry, they clearly showed severely mutilated legs with extensive scarring, open wounds, and deformities consistent with the described experiments. These visual records eliminated any possibility that the written accounts were exaggerated. Swedish medical experts who examined the photographs confirmed that the injuries displayed were consistent with deliberate surgical mutilation followed by infection, exactly as described in the written testimony. Within weeks, the document reached the War Crimes Commission in London, becoming key evidence in the case being built against Nazi medical personnel. The detailed nature of the documentation, specific dates, names, procedures, and outcomes, provided prosecutors with precisely the kind of evidence required for legal proceedings. The document was particularly valuable because it had been created contemporaneously with the events described, rather than as post-liberation testimony that might be challenged as relying on potentially faulty memories. Meanwhile, Ravensbrück entered its final, most chaotic phase. As Soviet forces approached from the east, the SS accelerated executions. Between January and April 1945, more than 6,000 women were gassed. Others were sent on death marches toward camps farther from the front, forced to walk hundreds of miles without food or proper clothing, shot if they fell behind or strayed from the column. These marches had a dual purpose: to prevent prisoners from being liberated by advancing Allied forces and to move them to locations where they might still provide slave labor for the collapsing Reich. Himmler, hoping to use prisoners as bargaining chips, arranged for the Red Cross to evacuate approximately 7,000 women. These evacuations were not humanitarian gestures, but calculated political maneuvers. Himmler believed that by releasing some prisoners to Western countries, he might secure better treatment if captured by Western rather than Soviet forces. He particularly targeted prisoners from neutral or Western Allied nations, while continuing to execute Eastern European and Jewish prisoners. Among those released through Red Cross negotiations were some of the surviving rabbits, including Jadwiga, who was carried onto a bus by 2 fellow prisoners. Her right leg, permanently damaged by the experiments, could not bear weight. She was feverish and malnourished, weighing just 84 pounds. Red Cross officials were shocked by her condition and that of the other experimental victims. They provided immediate medical care during the journey to Sweden, documenting the women's injuries and taking formal statements that would later supplement the smuggled document as evidence. The Swedish medical team that examined Jadwiga noted, "The subject presents with extensive tissue damage to the right lower extremity, consistent with multiple surgical interventions and subsequent infection. Significant muscle loss is evident. Bone structure has been compromised. The wounds show evidence of having been deliberately contaminated. Recovery of normal function is impossible. These injuries are unequivocally the result of non-therapeutic experimentation." Elizabeth was not among those released. As one of the resistance leaders known to have documented camp activities, she was considered too dangerous to be allowed to survive. Her name appeared on a list of special handling cases, prisoners to be eliminated before liberation. Camp guards made repeated attempts to locate her for transfer, a euphemism all prisoners recognized as meaning execution. On April 26th, as Soviet troops were less than 20 miles from the camp, the SS conducted a final selection. 2,000 women, Elizabeth among them, were marched to the gas chamber. The selected women included those with knowledge of camp operations, those who had witnessed the medical experiments, and those who had participated in resistance activities. The SS intended to eliminate all potential witnesses before abandoning the camp. The women knew their destination. Many had seen too many selections not to recognize the pattern. They walked in columns of 5, surrounded by guards with machine guns and dogs. Some prayed quietly. Others sang resistance songs from their home countries, Polish partisan anthems, French resistance ballads, Russian folk melodies with lyrics changed to express defiance. The guards ordered silence, but could not control 2,000 voices raised together. Elizabeth walked near the middle of the column between a French resistance fighter named Marie and a Russian partisan called Olga. They had made a pact to die with dignity, heads high, refusing to cry or beg. As they neared the building housing the gas chamber, they passed the camp crematorium. Smoke still rose from its chimney, processing the previous day's victims. What happened next remains somewhat unclear in historical records. According to accounts from survivors, the SS guards Increasingly concerned about their own fates and aware that evidence of mass murder would seal their doom, abandoned the final gassing operation. Some guards simply fled. Others claimed mechanical failures in the gas delivery system. Still others, perhaps hoping for leniency if captured, refused orders to proceed with mass killing. Instead, they fled the camp on April 28th, leaving only a small detachment behind. The skeleton crew was tasked with maintaining minimal order until formal surrender could be arranged. Most of these remaining guards removed their SS insignia, hoping to be mistaken for civilian employees rather than camp personnel. The abandonment created a power vacuum. The camp's electrical fence was no longer actively monitored. Guard towers stood empty. The hierarchy that had enforced brutal order for 6 years suddenly collapsed. For women who had lived under constant threat of execution for the slightest infraction, the absence of that threat was both liberating and disorienting. Some prisoners took immediate advantage of the situation to escape, not waiting for formal liberation. They cut holes in the fence using tools stolen from workshops, slipped away during night hours, and attempted to reach Allied lines. Many did not survive this final bid for freedom. Weakened by years of starvation and abuse, they collapsed on rural roads. Others were shot by roving SS or Wehrmacht units still operating in the area. Some were killed by German civilians who had been indoctrinated to view escaped prisoners as dangerous criminals. Elizabeth was among a group of about 20 women who escaped during the night of April 28th. They had been hiding in various locations around the camp since the aborted gassing operation 2 days earlier. Using wire cutters smuggled from the Siemens factory, they cut through the fence near the administrative building where guard coverage was minimal. The women split into smaller groups of 3 or 4 to avoid detection. Elizabeth's group included a Czech doctor named Helena and a French resistance member called Simone. They headed south rather than east, reasoning that German units retreating from the Soviet advance would make the eastern route more dangerous. Their goal was to reach American lines, which they believed were approaching from the southwest. On April 30th of 1945, Soviet troops arrived at Ravensbrück. They found approximately 3,000 prisoners still alive, most barely clinging to life. Many were too weak to stand. Some died in the days immediately following liberation, their bodies unable to recover from years of starvation and abuse, even with medical intervention. Soviet medical units established field hospitals in the former SS barracks. The bitter irony of this reversal lost on no one. The liberating troops were shocked by what they found, despite having previously liberated other concentration camps. The evidence of medical experimentation was particularly disturbing. Soviet doctors documented the injuries of surviving rabbits, taking photographs and detailed medical notes that would later be used in war crimes trials. Soviet investigators collected remaining documentation, gathered physical evidence from the gas chamber and crematorium, and began taking testimony from survivors strong enough to speak. Among them, hiding in the forest just beyond the camp perimeter, was Elizabeth Miller. She had escaped during the chaos of the final days, hiding in a drainage ditch for nearly 72 hours before making her way back to the camp to find other survivors. During her escape attempt, she had become separated from her companions. Helena had been shot by a German patrol. Simone had continued west, but her fate remained unknown. Elizabeth returned to the camp because she believed her testimony was essential. Despite the extreme danger of her escape attempt and the hardships of 3 days without food or adequate shelter, she felt compelled to ensure that the crimes she had witnessed were properly documented. When she emerged from the forest and approached Soviet positions, she was initially treated with suspicion. German civilians sometimes posed as former prisoners to receive better treatment. She had to show her prisoner tattoo and explain her story multiple times before being accepted as genuine. Elizabeth weighed 78 pounds when liberated. She suffered from advanced tuberculosis, malnutrition, and numerous chronic conditions resulting from years of imprisonment. Soviet doctors initially doubted she would survive. She was transported to a field hospital in a nearby town, where she received her first adequate medical care in 4 years. The simple provision of clean sheets, regular meals, and basic medications seemed miraculous after so long without such fundamentals. When strong enough to travel, Elizabeth was transferred to a hospital in Berlin that had been established specifically for concentration camp survivors. There, she began the slow process of physical recovery while simultaneously working with Allied investigators to document what she had witnessed at Ravensbrück. Her academic background and precise memory made her testimony particularly valuable. She could recall exact dates, names, and details of camp operations that other survivors, equally traumatized but less systematically observant, could not provide. Her testimony, combined with the smuggled document that had reached the Allies through Sini Tumaros, formed the backbone of the case against the Ravensbrück medical personnel. The document provided the structural framework, the what, when, and who of the experiments. Elizabeth's testimony filled in the how and why, explaining the camp's operations, the relationships between different SS personnel, and the broader context in which the experiments had occurred. At the doctor's trial at Nuremberg in 1946 and 1947, she testified for 3 days, describing in methodical detail the experiments she had witnessed. Her testimony was remarkable for its precision and emotional control. She presented facts without embellishment, dates without confusion, and identifications without hesitation. When defense attorneys attempted to challenge her recollections, suggesting she might be exaggerating or confusing different events, she referred them to specific dates, locations, and corroborating witnesses with such exactitude that the challenges collapsed. 16 doctors and nurses from Ravensbrück were tried at Nuremberg and in subsequent proceedings. Karl Gebhardt, who had overseen the experimental program, offered a defense that became tragically common among Nazi doctors, that his work had scientific value and was conducted for the greater good of medical knowledge. He argued that wartime necessitated extreme measures, and that the experimental subjects would have died anyway, so their suffering served a purpose. The tribunal rejected these arguments completely. The judges noted that legitimate medical research requires informed consent, minimization of suffering, and scientific controls, none of which were present in the Ravensbrück experiments. They also rejected the claim that the experiments had produced valuable scientific knowledge, citing expert testimony that the methodologies were so flawed and documentation so compromised by ideological bias that no reliable conclusions could be drawn from the results. Gebhardt was found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity and hanged on June 2nd of 1948. His final statement showed no remorse, only a cold assertion that history would vindicate his work. He maintained to the end that his experiments had been necessary, reflecting the profound moral corruption that had allowed medical professionals to redefine torture as research. Dr. Herta Oberhäuser, one of the few female physicians involved in the experiments, received a 20-year sentence. During her trial, she claimed she was simply following orders, and that, as a woman in a male-dominated profession, she had no choice but to comply with her superiors. This defense collapsed when former prisoners testified about her enthusiastic participation and personal cruelty during procedures. She was released after serving only 10 years, a leniency that outraged survivors. Most of the others received prison sentences of varying lengths, though many served only a fraction of their terms as Cold War politics led to early releases. By the early 1950s, the Western Allies had shifted focus from prosecuting Nazi crimes to rebuilding West Germany as a bulwark against Soviet expansion. This political calculation resulted in reduced sentences, early paroles, and in some cases, the quiet reintegration of former Nazis into professional and public life. Fritz Fischer, who had assisted Gebhardt in many of the most brutal experiments, received a life sentence that was later commuted to 15 years. He was released in 1954 and subsequently practiced medicine in West Germany until retirement. Despite his conviction for crimes against humanity, he was allowed to return to the medical profession, a fact that horrified the women who still carried the scars of his work on their bodies. Dorothea Binz, the deputy chief guard known for her particular cruelty, was executed by hanging in May 1947. Unlike some defendants who claimed ignorance or duress, Binz never denied her actions. She appeared proud of her role at Ravensbrück even during her trial, showing no remorse for the beatings, maulings, and executions she had overseen. Her final words before execution were reportedly, "I did my duty for Germany." The camp commandant, Fritz Sören, attempted to escape justice by fleeing to Bavaria and living under a false identity. He was captured in 1949 and extradited to France, where he was tried for crimes against French prisoners at Ravensbrück. He was executed by firing squad in June 1950. Jadwiga Kaminska survived and testified against her tormentors from a wheelchair. Her testimony was particularly powerful because she could show the court her mutilated leg, physical evidence that could not be denied or explained away. When defense attorneys suggested that her injuries might have resulted from legitimate medical treatment for pre-existing conditions, she removed the bandages covering her leg, revealing scars that medical experts confirmed could only have resulted from deliberate surgical mutilation, followed by induced infection. After the trials, she returned to Poland after the trials, but found a country transformed by Soviet occupation. Her resistance activities, once directed against the Nazis, now made her suspect to the communist authorities. Former members of the Polish resistance, particularly those with connections to the London-based government in exile, were often viewed as potential counter-revolutionaries by the new Soviet-aligned government. Jadwiga lived in obscurity until her death in 1976, her health permanently destroyed by the experiments. She never married or had children. The extensive damage to her reproductive system, a consequence of malnutrition, trauma, and infections contracted during the experiments, left her unable to conceive. She worked as a translator of scientific texts, her education and language skills providing a modest living. Her neighbors knew her as a quiet woman who walked with difficulty and rarely spoke about her past. In her final years, as Poland's political climate slowly changed, she began speaking to small groups about her experiences. She felt compelled to share her testimony as she saw neo-Nazi movements beginning to emerge in Europe. The greatest danger, she told a group of university students in 1974, is not that people will forget what happened, but that they will remember it incorrectly, as an aberration, as something that could not happen again. It can happen again anywhere ideology matters more than humanity. Elisabeth Müller returned to Munich and completed her interrupted studies, eventually becoming a professor of German literature at the University of Munich. Her academic career focused on writers silenced during the Nazi era, particularly Jewish and politically progressive authors whose works had been banned and burned. Her scholarly work became a form of restoration, bringing suppressed voices back into the literary canon and ensuring that cultural erasure did not succeed even decades after the attempted genocide. She married in 1948, a fellow concentration camp survivor named Thomas Weber, who had spent 3 years at Dachau. They had no children, both having suffered physiological damage during their imprisonment that made conception impossible. Their marriage was described by friends as a profound partnership built on shared understanding that others could not comprehend. They rarely spoke about their camp experiences to outsiders, but found in each other the recognition and acceptance that only fellow survivors could provide. Alongside her academic career, Elisabeth dedicated her life to documenting the experiences of Ravensbrück survivors, establishing an archive that grew to include more than 3,000 testimonies. She traveled throughout Europe to interview former prisoners, recording their stories on early tape recorders, transcribing their accounts, and collecting any physical evidence they had preserved: camp uniforms, letters written after liberation, medical records documenting their injuries. This archive, initially stored in her home office, eventually became the Ravensbrück Memorial Collection at the University of Munich. Her work faced significant challenges. In the immediate post-war years, many survivors were reluctant to speak about their experiences. Some feared reviving traumatic memories. Others encountered disbelief when they described the atrocities they had witnessed. Still others wanted to protect their children from knowledge that might burden them. Elisabeth approached each woman with extraordinary patience, sometimes conducting multiple interviews over years before a complete account emerged. When asked why she devoted her life to such painful memories, she responded, "To forget would be to kill them a second time." Every woman who died there deserves to have her name remembered, her suffering acknowledged. The experiments at Ravensbrück were not just crimes against those specific women, they were crimes against humanity itself. If we allow such things to fade from memory, we risk their repetition. Her work became increasingly urgent as she observed how quickly German society wanted to move beyond its Nazi past. The 1950s and 60s were characterized by what Germans called Vergangenheitsbewältigung, the struggle to come to terms with the past. Many preferred to focus on economic reconstruction, to cast themselves as victims of Nazi leadership rather than participants or bystanders, to emphasize their own suffering during and after the war rather than their complicity. Elisabeth encountered this resistance directly when she began teaching a university course on literature of the concentration camps in 1959. Students questioned why they should study such depressing material. Colleagues suggested her focus was too political for a literature department. The university administration received complaints from parents concerned that their children were being made to feel guilty for events before their birth. She persisted nonetheless, writing in her course syllabus, "Literature is not merely aesthetic. It is ethical. It is historical. It is testimonial. To separate the beautiful from the terrible is to create a false understanding of human expression." The voices that emerged from the camps, often writing on stolen paper with stolen pencils, at risk of execution, created some of the most profound literature of our century precisely because it emerged from the darkest circumstances human beings can create. Today, a memorial stands on the grounds of the former camp. The sculpture Tragende by Will Lammert depicts a woman carrying another woman, commemorating the solidarity that existed among prisoners even in the darkest circumstances. Visitors can see the preserved buildings, the walls still marked with the names of women who scratched their identities into stone, refusing to be reduced to numbers even as the system attempted to erase them completely. The most powerful testimony, however, remains the words of the survivors themselves. Their accounts provide insights that physical remains cannot. They describe not just what happened, but how it felt, how women responded, how they maintained humanity in a system designed to destroy it, and how they rebuilt lives after experiencing trauma that defied comprehension. The medical experiments at Ravensbrück represent one of the darkest chapters in a dark period of human history. They demonstrate how quickly professional ethics can collapse under ideological pressure, how easily human subjects can be transformed into research materials when empathy is suspended, and how systems of oppression rely on the willing participation of individuals, making their own moral compromises. Yet the story also contains profound examples of human resilience and solidarity. Women who shared their last crumbs of bread, women who risked their lives to document atrocities, women who hid the vulnerable among them. women who testified despite trauma to ensure justice. Their resistance reminds us that even in the most controlled environments, human dignity can assert itself in unexpected ways. In the words carved into the memorial wall at Ravensbrück, the knowledge of what happened here must be preserved for all time as a warning.